In the last Warcry video, we looked at some of the baselines for fighters' characteristics. In this video, we're going to take a little more of a focused look at the cheap fighters, hopefully picking out some outliers and fighters that might be of particular interest. Cheap, of course, is a relative term. We're going to be looking at the entire range of fighters, but when you already have a warband picked out, your options are limited. For Soul Blight Gravelords, for example, cheap is 40 points, but for the Stormcast Eternals, cheap is 115 points. Now, comparing a 40-point skeleton with a 115-point Gryph-hound isn't really a fair comparison. The Gryph-hound is just going to be so much better. So for this video, we're going to look at a very tight slice. In this case, fighters between 40 and 60 points inclusive. That's a total of 26 fighters in total. It should give us a decent idea of what chaff units in the game look like. As a reminder, our baseline is move 4, toughness 4, 3 wounds per 25 points, so we can expect around 6 wounds in this range. For damage, I typically look at the average damage per activation against toughness 4 targets. In that case, it's about 1 damage per 25 points, so roughly 2 damage for these fighters. If we try keep that in mind as a baseline, it should give us a good starting point to evaluate the fighters. With this selection of fighters, we can have a quick look over the distributions. Movement values are roughly evenly spread between 3, 4 and 5, but we have one outlier at 6. Toughness is primarily 3 and 4, but again we have an outlier at 1 toughness and 3 fighters at 5 toughness. For wounds, it's an even spread between 6, 8 and 10 wounds, but with 2 outliers at 12. Lastly, the average damage value typically falls around the 2-point range, although there are some higher or lower, with one even pushing close to 3 damage. At 40 points there are only 3 fighters, all in the Soul Blight Graveguard warband. All have move 3, which is a significant drawback, but they all have the minion rune mark, which gives them access to the double ability Shambling Horde, giving them a bonus move action equal to the value of the ability. It's not as good as having movement 4, but it could help in a pinch. The zombie has 3 toughness and 10 wounds. The skeletons have 4 toughness and 8 wounds. The skeleton with spear has a range of 2, but still does the same damage as the zombie of about 1.6 per attack, while the skeleton with the blade does slightly more, coming out to 2 damage per attack. So you get to choose essentially between 2 extra wounds, 2 range, or slightly more damage. I'm inclined to go with the skeletons in the hope that the extra toughness is worth the 2 less wounds. And then probably the spear on the basis that they can attack without being in melee, forcing the opponent to waste an action moving towards them. Next up we have the 45 points, which is taken up exclusively by Grots. The Noblar is part of the Ogre Maw Tribe's warband, while the Pot and Stab Grots are part of the Cruel Boys. Each have 6 wounds and move 4. The Pot Grot has a poor damage profile of 1.3 per attack, while the other 2 have a decent 2 damage on average. The Trapper rune mark gives the Noblar a double ability called Sneaky Traps, giving any enemy fighter impact damage if they end up within 3 inches of Noblar. It's very thematic, but probably a waste of dice to use. Anyone getting close to the Noblar is probably just going to kill it. Compared to the previous 40-point Undead, this Noblar is move 4 and is doing decent damage, so he is a pretty good vanilla cheap fighter. The Pot Grot is under the curve, but does have an extremely cool ability. It's a triple called Brood Elixir. You roll a number of dice equal to the ability, and for each 4+, get to heal 3 damage to a nearby target. So we can follow one of your big guys around and top them up if they get a bit low. The Minion and Bulwark rune marks on the Stab Grot don't actually open up any abilities, but do let it be a target for other fighters' support actions. The triple Stab 'em Good will give the Stab Grot an extra attack dice, while the double You Hold 'em Off will give the Stab Grot a bonus move or attack option. Probably not great abilities to use on the Stab Grot, to be honest. That aside, the Stab Grot is exactly the same as the Noblar for characteristics, but has 1 extra toughness, which is really good. Unlike the Noblars that you can buy a big box of, the Stab Grot and the Pot Grot are both unique models that come with heroes or as a single in a big box, so you're unlikely to have more than one of them. It's a little disappointing, as that Stab Grot really is great. He's the cheapest model that hits all of the baseline numbers. Next up we move into the 50-point range. Here we have a Mortek Guard, an Arcanaut Privateer, a Plague Bearer, and a Spider Swarm. All apart from the Spider Swarm have 3 move, while the Spider Swarm has an astounding 6 move. The damage profiles for the Mortek Guard and the Plague Bearer are quite similar, 2.5 for the Plague Bearer and 2.6 for the Mortek Guard, making them both very similar models. The Warrior rune mark for the Plague Bearer does open up a triple, Cloud of Flies, which reduces attacks against this model by 1 dice for the rest of the round. It seems a bit of a waste to waste a triple to protect a 50-point model. The Arcanaut Company Privateer is a really exciting model for a number of reasons. It's cheap at 50, it does only have 3 move, but it makes up for that with a range 8 attack. The average damage for the melee is 2, and for the range is 1.3, so that is a bit of a drop. But having a group of these on the table will let you safely lay down damage from range. They also have 12 wounds, making them surprisingly sturdy for a 50-point model. And last up we have the Spider Swarm. With 4 dice on attack, it is still doing 2 damage on average despite its 1 strength. With only 6 wounds and toughness 1 though, it's probably one of the easiest fighters to kill in the game. The Agile rune mark does give it access to a double that lets it ignore vertical terrain, which is decent, but quite situational. Alright, at 55 we get into Goblin territory. There are 10 fighters at this point cost across multiple warbands. For the majority of these profiles, we're seeing 2 average damage. There are 4 goblins, all with 4 move and 6 wounds, and a 50-50 split between 3 and 4 toughness. The big difference with these fighters is the rune mark they have. The Stabber with the barbed net has a Trapper rune mark, which opens up the amazing double barbed net. You pick a target within 3 inches, and on a 3+, they cannot make a move or disengage action for the remainder of the round. So this 55-point model could lock down a 200 or 300-point model in place for an entire turn. That's crazy good. The Squig Herder has the Agile rune mark, which opens up 2 abilities. The reaction Spore Cloud lets you add 1 to the toughness of nearby friendly units against range attacks. Situationally cool, but, relatively ignorable. The other ability is the triple Go That Way, giving a friendly beast a bonus move action. The beasts that the Gloomspike gets have access to are the Cave Squigs. The Cave Squig is an 80-point cost model. It's got 4 move, 4 toughness, 10 wounds, and a reasonable damage profile. Moving out of the goblins, we immediately have 2 great picks. The Plains Runner for the Untamed Beasts, and the Crypt Ghouls for the Flesh Eater Courts. These both have identical stats, an average damage of 2, toughness 3, 8 wounds, and a fantastic move of 5. Very simple, but really everything you're looking for in a fighter. Next up we have the 3 death models. All are slow at 3 movement, but hard to kill at 10 wounds. The Mortex in particular have an impressive 5 toughness. The Graveguard is the highest average damage of this bracket with 3 average damage, and interestingly both the Mortex have similar damage of 2. Although the sword does slightly edge ahead against toughness 3 targets, I'm tempted to say to go with the spear every time. Again, the Graveguard does have access to the Shambling Horde double ability, so you can push them forward a burst of speed. But obviously you're only going to be able to do this so many times because you only get so many doubles you can use. The Mortek Guard have the Bulwark rune mark, which will let them use the double Form Shield Wall. I'm not really sure they're going to benefit much from going to 6 toughness though. 5 will be plenty 90% of the time. In the last bracket we're looking at today, we have 6 fighters at 60 points. The Beasts of Chaos are blessed with 3 options to pick from, all with move 5. The Ungors are an interesting case, as it looks like the bonus crit damage was put on the wrong fighter, as the short spear is just better, with better range and more crit damage. Maybe we can expect this to be ratted and that extra crit damage to move over. But in the meantime, always go with the spear, which has an average of 1.6 compared to the 1.3 damage of just a blade. Meanwhile, the Gore with the pair of blades is doing the expected 2 points damage. This is essentially the same as the Plains Runner and the Crypt Ghoul, but costing 5 points more, but you get 2 extra wounds. Personally, out of these 3, the Ungors and Gore, I think I'd go with the double blades every time. Looking at the Ironbreaker is tough at 5 and has 12 wounds and a decent average damage of 2. He's only 3 moved though. As a part of the Cities of Sigmar, there are options around which abilities he has access to. The Bulwark rune mark does not give him an ability, but some heroes can order a shield wall. Although, as with the Mortex, pushing your toughness from 5 up to 6, which does seem a little redundant. The Living City Warband, which is one of the Cities of Sigmar, does have a double that will add 3 to the next move. The Anvil Guard Loyalists could give a +2 move as a double, but only for the first round of the game. With 2 moves of 5 in the first turn, you could get a lot of work done. But if your Ironbreaker didn't arrive till the second turn, then they no longer have this option. Similarly, the Tempest's Eye Warband, again another Cities of Sigmar, does have a double with an extra move, but again it's only during the first battle round. Another move 5 fighter, the Broodkin, has a great looking 5 crit, which brings the damage of the claw up to a very nice 2.33 damage. It also has a ranged 2 option, doing 1.6 damage. The Destroyer rune mark lets the Broodkin use Scuttling Symbiosis to give a Spider Swarm an extra move or attack as a double, while the Scout rune mark gives them a triple they can use as a Troll-like ability, maybe doing some damage to someone within 6 inches. The Broodkin is only 10 points more expensive than a Spider Swarm. And while the Swarm is amazing at move 6, the Broodkin is only 1 slower at 5. Damage does go up from 2 to 2.3, along with the option of a range 2 side. Survivability goes up, with toughness going from 1 to 3 and wounds going from 6 to 8. What's especially interesting in this profile is even though you could argue to replace the Spider Swarm, the Scuttling Symbiosis ability actually means it works particularly well with the Spider Swarm. Lastly, we have the Chaos Marauder with Flail, who has solid numbers with 2 average damage, 4 move, 3 toughness and 10 wounds, putting him above the expected curve. On top of that, the weapon has a range 3, making this a very interesting model. And that's it. It's every fighter from 40 to 60 points currently in the game. The average damage for this range typically hovered around 2. Low damage models like the Netta and the Potgrot did actually make up for it with their abilities, which was nice to see. At the top end of the damage, we had the move 3 fighters, specifically the Graveguard with Blade and Shield, the Mortek with Great Blade, and the Plaguebearer. For wounds, the 2 Dwarfs stood out at 12 wounds, while the Armbreaker and 2 Morteks with Shield were toughness 5. That made the Armbreaker the hardest to kill fighter in this bracket. There were an impressive 7 move 5 fighters, and even 1 move 6 fighter. The move 3 fighters were essentially thematic, all being dwarfs undead, or almost dead in the case of the Plaguebearer. If I had to pick some standouts, I'd probably go with the Archanaut, who at 50 points has solid stats and a ranged weapon to make up for his move 3. The Netta, due to that bonkers great ability that can shut down an enemy fighter for a fraction of the cost. Although the Planesrunner and the Crypt Ghoul are essentially identical, I suspect the greater range of models in the Flesh Eater Quartz Warband will give more options with the Crypt Ghoul as a base. Although a little bit more expensive, the Gore with 2 weapons looks very interesting to me. A box of Gores is actually quite cheap, which makes me think about building a Warband out of them. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and comment.